And I was thinking about that today. And I received news from Vanuatu of the death of the eldest son of our brother Garen and sister Elsie Rangon of the Malakula Ecclesia. He died this morning of leukemia. It seems that it was not diagnosed beforehand. He was waiting at the hospital. He needed a blood transfusion so he could be transported to Villa. The way you get a blood transfusion there is you bring your family into the hospital and the blood is transferred from the donor to the recipient. There are no blood banks. The family were unable to get up to him because the river was in flood. And he died this morning. Unfortunately, Manu was not baptised. And in a village over there this night, they'll be preparing his body for burial. And he'll be laid, I'm sure, next to the grave of his sister who died at 2 years of age. Very dear and humble brother and sister who would be known to a number of you here, and I'm sure a number of you may have met Manu. He was a very lovely young man. Sorry. But to accept the life, the will of God in our own lives is one thing, isn't it? To be able to accept that in the lives of our children can be another thing altogether, as many here would know and would have experienced. Before these two boys were born, God told their mother that she was to have two manner of people, two very distinct individuals. And we saw from Romans chapter 9 that God would use this singular conception, this one pregnancy, this one womb, and from that one lump he would make one vessel to honour and one to dishonour. It shows God's power of election, doesn't it? Power of God's choosing. The foreknowledge of God is shown in the lives of these two boys. They would be two manner of people. When we come to the end of Genesis chapter 25, we read that, don't we? Verse 25. The first came out red all over like a hairy garment. They called his name, and after that came his brother out, and he took and his hand took hold on Esau's heel, and his name was called Jacob. And Isaac was 80 years old when she bare him. Jacob the heel catcher, catching hold of his brother's leg as though to say, "You're not going to beat me out to fresh air." And that was a continued thing through his life, wasn't it? Trying to get the upper hand over his brother. There was that conflict that was within the womb which would continue on throughout their lives. And it says in verse 27, it says, the boys grew, and Esau was a cunning hunter, a man of the field, and Jacob was a plain man, dwelling in tents. And when we consider this, we look at the idea of a hunter. It comes from the idea of one who will chase the game. Whereas the one that dwells in tents, he's got a sedentary lifestyle, hasn't he? So there's one that's roaming the hillsides, he's out there in the open places, and there's another one that's staying at home. There's one that lives in the field, in the wide open expanse, and there's another that dwells in tents in an enclosed space. So just in these simple details, we see two manner of people. They were poles apart, these boys, weren't they? In everything, they were separated. And this idea of dwelling in tents is also associated with the idea of animal husbandry, isn't it, throughout Scripture? And Adar and Jubal, he was the father of such as dwell in tents, such as have cattle. So there was this idea of those that dwelt in tents were those that had a sedentary lifestyle and they cared for their flocks. This was a life of steady work, wasn't it? The life of a farmer, the life of a husbandman. To care for the flocks and the herds so that they would then in turn provide for you. It was a matter of taking time, wasn't it, to build the numbers and the strength of your flock and herd, and caring for them each day and ensuring that they were looked after and staying nearby them and slowly seeing to the future, thinking, if I keep going like this, if I keep keeping the best of my flocks, I'm going to build them up and they are going to see me through in the end. That was Jacob, wasn't it? Whereas Esau, his brother, he was totally different, wasn't he? He was a hunter. He took risks. He wanted to live for the day. He wanted to be free to come and go. He didn't want responsibilities, did he? He lacked stability and security. He left those animals. They were out in the wild. They were looking after themselves until he had an opportunity to come and take one as prey. That was the two different boys, wasn't it? Two manner of people. Totally different in their outlook in life. And here's Jacob counting his flocks, isn't he? Staying at home, slowly building, planning for the future, thinking ahead, thinking into the future. And Esau thinking merely for the day. And that marked them apart, didn't it? One who thought about the future and one who only considered the day. And it says a lot about the way, the one whom God would choose, wouldn't it? Some of the aspects of their characters are shown in the incident, isn't it, where Esau sold his birthright at the end of chapter 25. One thing we notice is there's a difference in the desired diet, isn't there? One wanted the venison and the other one wanted pottage. I think I might know which one diet I would prefer. But here in this exchange, we might ask the question, was it too much for Jacob to give his brother a bowl of lentils? They were already on the stove. Was it too much for him to spare a bowl of lentils for his brother without charging him for it? It says a lot about their relationship, doesn't it? And here's Jacob showing his calculating ways, isn't he? He's looking to the future and he wants to invest wisely. I've got a bowl of lentils here. I wonder what I can make out of that. And he's considering, isn't he, the benefits that might come after the death of his father. A long way off. He's looking to the future, isn't he? He's calculating, he's planning for the future. And I would put to you that it seems highly unlikely to me that the thought of acquiring the birthright just popped into Jacob's head right at that instant. Oh, you want some lentils? Well, how about you trade me for the birthright? I think he had been, ever since he caught his brother's heel in the womb, he'd been planning to overtake him, hadn't he? He'd been thinking about this. He'd been scheming towards this end for all time. And here was an opportunity too good to miss. It's unlikely, too, that Esau was literally at death's door. More likely, he's just a bit hungry from having been out hunting. And it says in the record, it says that he despised his birthright. He despised his birthright for a bowl of lentils, for the present. He gave up all that might have come in the future to look after himself for the moment. So the present desire outweighs any value of a future inheritance. And that word, the idea of him despising his birthright, is the same word that's used of Goliath seeing the stripling David approach. He disdained him. And Michael, seeing David dancing before the ark, she despised him in her heart. Of Christ, it says he was despised and rejected of men. And it was that same despising that Esau had for his birthright, which not only came with the rights, but it came with responsibilities too, didn't it? To be the leader of the family upon the death of the father. And he despised that. He considered nothing for his future. All he was interested in what he could get out of today. And once again, we see why God chose the other. So what Esau despised, Jacob prized. In verse 28 of chapter 25, we read, "And Isaac loved Esau because he did eat of his venison, but Rebekah loved Jacob." Rebekah loved Jacob. No reason is given. Does a mother need to have a reason to love her child? Well, no. It's probably more surprising that it doesn't say she loved Esau. In fact, Rebekah did have a regard for Esau, because we see that in the end of chapter 26 it says that the women that Esau had married were a grief of mind to Isaac and to Rebekah. It wasn't she was disinterested in her older son, but she loved Jacob. Jacob was her favourite. But we are told that Isaac loved Esau because he did eat of his venison. I don't know what this says about Esau, but maybe you needed a reason to love this boy. And for Isaac, it was that he loved the food that he went and caught for him. And in fact, this idea of this love of venison, this love of the savoury meat, is something that just stands out, doesn't it, in the record about Isaac. He just had a hang-up about it. So in Genesis chapter 27, we read time and time again, "Make me savoury meat, such as I love. Bring me venison and make me savoury meat, that I may eat. Go now to the flock and fetch me from thence 2 good kids of the goats, and I will make them savoury meat for thy father, such as he loveth." And so Jacob, he went and he fetched and brought them to his mother, and his mother made him his savoury meat, such as he loved, as his father loved. And he also made savoury meat and brought it unto his father, and said unto his father, "Let my father arise and eat of his son's venison, that thy soul may bless me." So it was enough for Esau to think he was going to gain the blessing by bringing that to his father. So it seems that Isaac, in his life, he had this hang-up about this food, about venison, this savoury meat, such as he loved. And he'd do anything to get hold of that. And he had this almost like a blind spot. And it's amazing, isn't it, how apparently unimportant things can distract us or blind us to bigger issues. Isaac loved Esau because he loved the savoury meat. And therefore, he didn't see a son who needed correction. He didn't see a son who was not acceptable in God's eyes. He loved the one whom God hated. As it says in Romans chapter 9. As it is written, "Jacob have I loved, but Esau have I hated." And that comes from Malachi chapter 1. "I loved you, said the Lord. Yet ye say, Wherein hast thou loved us? Was not Esau Jacob's brother, saith the Lord? Yet I loved Jacob, and I hated Esau, and I laid his mountain and his heritage waste for the dragons of the wilderness." So here Isaac did not see things clearly. He did not see things as God saw them. And I actually don't think Rebekah really did either. I think she didn't necessarily love Jacob for all the right reasons. But here was a father that could not, he had a blind spot in relation to his son, and he did not correct him. And God's evaluation of the twins stood in stark contrast to that of Isaac, didn't it? And here it is. It can be very challenging, can't it? Very painful to accept the choices that God makes in our lives, especially if that affects our children. And it's something which some have had to learn to accept, isn't it? A great pain in their lives. But here it was something that Isaac needed to learn. And here there was a source of tension in the family, wasn't it? Over this divided loyalties, the mother looking to Jacob and the father looking to Esau. And it seems that this was a source of tension and disharmony in the home. The reality was that they were both earthen vessels, weren't they? They were both made of clay. And both of them needed to be corrected, needed to be made to be something glorious. And the parents on either side did not see that so clearly, did they? Because we know that Rebekah did not stand up for Jacob in his deceptive ways, did she? She did not see Jacob for who he was. And Isaac did not see Esau for who he was. And they harboured fleshly thinking in their children, didn't they? They allowed that. They allowed them to remain as unpolished earthen vessels, when they should have been seeing both of those boys as needing correction and direction. They both needed it. And this brought disharmony in the home, didn't it? Because there won't be harmony in our lives when fleshly thinking is being harboured. And sometimes, as parents, we have to be willing to give that guidance and direction, to accept that our children are made of clay. And they're not perfect. And though we love them, and because we love them, we need to correct and direct them. And all parents have to learn that lesson, don't they? As Isaac and Rebekah did. And I guess as parents, we tend to see our children with a different lens than others may. And we have to be able to see our children through the eyes of God, don't we? That's what Isaac and Rebekah needed to be able to do, didn't they? To view their children through the eyes of God and see what he saw and what he would do with them. In Genesis chapter 26, we read, there was a famine in the land, beside the famine that was in the days of Abraham. And here we're taken back, aren't we? We're taken back to the famine that was in the days of Abraham. And we know that it was in this famine, which was recorded in Genesis chapter 12, verse 10, there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was grievous in the land. And we know what that led to, don't we? When Abram left the land in which he had been directed by God to sojourn, he went down there, didn't he? And he said of Sarah, his wife, that she was his sister. And Isaac is told here in Genesis chapter 26, don't follow the journey of your father. And was that just about going down to Egypt? Or was God thinking about something else as well? He says to him, go not down into Egypt, dwell in the land which I shall tell thee of. Sojourn in this land, and I will be with thee, and will bless thee. For unto thee and unto thy seed I will give all these countries, and I will perform the oath which I swear unto Abram thy father. And I will make thy seed as to multiply as the stars of heaven, and will give unto thy seed all these countries, and in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. Sojourn in this land, and I will be with thee, God said. So here, God sees, doesn't he? God places upon Isaac the same requirement that he placed upon his father. When God had said to Abram, he had said, Abram, get thee out of thy country, from thy kindred, from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. And it was that obedience of Abraham to do what God had said that led him to receive those blessings, didn't it? And here God comes along to Isaac and he says, Isaac, I want you to stay in the land that I led your father to. I wanted Abraham to get out and go to that land and I would bless him. I want you, Isaac, to stay in that land and I will bless you. And so Isaac was called upon to show not only the faith of his father Abraham, but also that obedience unto his father. Sojourn in this land, and I will be with thee, and I will bless thee. But what happens? Well, verse 5, because Abram obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. That's interesting, isn't it? Here, in Genesis 26, verse 5, Abraham obeyed my voice, kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws before Moses was ever on the scene. Isn't that interesting? So I wonder then how many laws and statutes, commandments and charges that had been revealed to the patriarchs before Moses came along. It seems that there was more, wasn't it, than just not to eat of the fruit of the tree. That obviously God had delivered to his servants of those times commandments, statutes, charges, laws. It's such an emphasis, isn't it? You can't miss that, can you? That obviously God had given a number of requirements upon his people, though they may not all be recorded for us. But Abraham was obedient to whatever God had asked of him. And Isaac was now called to show that same level of obedience. And so it says that Isaac dwelt in Gerar. Now, if we go back to the map, so Isaac dwelt in Gerar, so we can see Gerar out here, hopefully, just up there. So Isaac dwelt in Gerar, and because there's a number of place names that we come across as we go through this little section here now. But here, Isaac makes the same mistake as his father. He doesn't go down to Egypt, but he follows his father's mistake, doesn't he? The men of the place asked him of his wife, verse 7, and he said, "She is my sister." That's exactly what Abraham had said, hadn't it? But for Abraham, it was a half-truth. For Isaac, it wasn't. It was a lie. And what example did this provide to his son Jacob, who needed correction on this very matter? It wasn't a good example, was it? Isaac perceives a threat, doesn't he? And maybe it wasn't premeditated, but he saw a danger coming, and as a way out of it, he used deception for his protection, rather than demonstrating faith in the God he served. So here's Isaac showing an example of deception, as Rebekah later would too. And here, by doing this, Isaac shows a lack of care, of protection, of respect, and of love for Rebekah. Imagine how Rebekah felt. different, wasn't it, to how, when he had married her, how he had taken his bride and given her his mother Sarah's tent. He'd shown her great honour and respect at that time. But here, he's forgotten to show that. And so his wife is made to feel a burden, a problem, a risk. And she sees that her honour is of less value to her husband than his own personal safety. Lest I die for her. Very sad, isn't it? A marriage that started so well, it was not maintained on such a high level. And while a type of Christ, Isaac here falls well short of the example that is provided by the antitype. Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the ecclesia and gave himself for it, lest I die for her, says Isaac. Christ says, I will die for her. Because we're reminded, aren't we, brethren, husbands, that we are to dwell with our wives according to knowledge. Our knowledge of our wives, our knowledge of their vulnerabilities, our knowledge of their sensitivities, our knowledge of their cares and fears, giving honour unto the wife as unto the weaker vessel, more honour, as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers be not hindered. So here in 1 Peter chapter 3 it says, if we want God to answer our prayers, if we want to go to God and ask for his protection, his care, his support, his love, well, we better show those same things to our wives. How can we go and ask the God of heaven for those things? For his care, his support, his protection, his provision. And we're not willing to do that for our wife. So it says in 1 Peter chapter 3, if you treat your wives like that, your prayers will be hindered. God is not going to hear your prayers. God's not going to answer your requirements or requests if you don't perceive and provide the same for your wife. And this is what Isaac failed to do, wasn't it? He failed to provide for his wife what he wanted God to do for him. He wanted God to bless him. He wanted God to provide for him, to care for him and to keep him. And yet he was not willing to do the same for his wife. It's sad, isn't it? But unfortunately, it can happen, can't it? And so we need to maintain, don't we, that honour and respect in our marriages, in our relationships, that we care for our wives, we care for others, we care for those, our fellow servants. We show that respect and honour and care for others so that our prayers might be heard by God when we seek the same from him. And God does not plague Abraham as he had done to Pharaoh and his house, nor does he appear to Abimelech in a dream as he had in the incident with Abraham in Genesis 20 verse 3. But Abimelech discovers the truth for himself, doesn't he? He looks out the window and he saw Isaac was sporting with Rebekah his wife. And Abimelech called Isaac and said, behold, of a surety she is thy wife, and how saidst thou, she is my sister? And Isaac said unto him, because I said, lest I die for her. And Abimelech said, the Gentile says to the patriarch of Israel, what is this that thou hast done unto us? One of the people might lightly have lain with thy wife, and thou shouldest brought guiltiness upon us. It's a double shame, isn't it? when we fail to uphold God's principles and when people in the world call us out for it. Shame on us and shame on the God we serve. That's what happens. And here it was here, wasn't it? Here was this man of enormous faith, a patriarch who will be in the kingdom. We know that. He will be in the kingdom. Yet he allowed himself to fall in a way that brought shame upon himself and upon the God he served. And yet, in spite of that, look what happens. Verse 12. And Isaac sowed in the land and received in the same year 100-fold. And Yahweh blessed him. Isaac sowed in that land. Genesis 26 verse 1. And there was a famine in the land. And Isaac goes out, after having been so unfaithful towards God, and he goes and plants a crop in that land, and he receives 100-fold. And we know that that's an exceptionally good return, isn't it? Christ says that in the parable of the sower, doesn't it? Other fell on good ground and did yield fruit, and it sprang up, increased, and brought forth some 30, some 60, some 100-fold. And that's exactly what Isaac got here. A blessing from God. And how unworthy he must have felt at that time, having just gone through that experience with Abimelech and Rebekah. And Yahweh blessed him. Verse 13. And the man waxed great and went forward and grew until he became very great. Do you get the idea that the scriptures are emphasising the great blessings that God brought upon his servant Isaac? Blesses him in verse 12. The man waxed great, went forward, and grew until he became very great. And this is a story of Isaac's life, wasn't it? A story of blessings. We know from Genesis chapter 25, Abraham gave all that he had unto Isaac, and Abraham was a very wealthy man, wasn't he? And God blessed his son Isaac, Genesis 25 verse 11. Yahweh was entreated of him, and Rebekah his wife conceived when she had been barren. And God says in Genesis 26 verse 5, I will be with thee and I will bless thee. And Yahweh blessed him. And in Genesis 26 verse 24, I am with thee and will bless thee. Isaac, the patriarch, the man chosen by God, the blessed son, the beloved son, he was one who was the blessed, wasn't he? In so many ways by his God. So unworthy was he of that. And how unworthy are we of God's smallest blessings? And yet we receive them, don't we? We receive them 100-fold, more than 100-fold, because we will have life everlasting through the grace of the God that blessed Isaac. And with so much wealth, it would have been easy, wouldn't it, for him to lose his focus on the promise, on something better to come. Such a rich and wealthy man, very great, enormous amount of wealth. It would have been easy to do that, wouldn't it? But yet in God's wisdom, while he had so much, he did not have any land as a possession. And Isaac was willing to accept that. There were things that Isaac just accepted in his life which we must take our hat off to him for. But when it came to his sons, he struggled. But here he was, he accepted God's will, didn't he? He's got all of this wealth, all of this money, and he waited on the promise of God. He didn't seek to use his wealth to go out and acquire the land, did he? He sojourned in the land that God gave him. So we've got this contrast, haven't we? These signs of great lack of faith, and on other aspects of his life, he was a man full of faith, wasn't he? Full of respect and love of God, waiting patiently for God. And I'm sure we can all relate to that, can't we? The highs and the lows of our spiritual life. And here was Isaac going through some of those. And the Philistines envied him. They saw this man and all his great wealth, and they envied him. For all the wells which his father's servants had digged in the days of Abraham his father, the Philistines had stopped them and filled them with earth. Why would you do that? Perfectly good well, and you go and fill it in. Seems a bit bizarre, doesn't it? But a well indicated the provision of a long-term or a permanent occupation of the land, didn't it? So if you had a source of water there, then anyone could come and set up in that place, take up residence there. If there was no water around, people couldn't stay there very long, could they? And we know from the events of World War I, Lawrence of Arabia, if anyone's followed the stories of Lawrence of Arabia, when he had to go down into we're coming through the deserts on the north of where was he heading down to? Down to the Gulf there, and he had to charge through the areas where there was no water around, and so the Arabs thought they were safe because he couldn't get through there. Water was a huge issue, wasn't it? And so if you had areas with no water, it was a defence. So the Arabs had all their guns, and the Turks had all their guns facing out to the sea, and they didn't think Lawrence of Arabia could get them because there was no wells, no water in that space. It was a defence, wasn't it? It was a means of defence. Not to have any water supply in an area was a means of defence. And we know how important it was too. World War II, wasn't it? The battle for Beersheba, how the Light Horse Brigade had to charge through the night to try to get up there and to get to those wells of water, didn't they? Because it was vital for them to get to those supplies of water for their horses at that time. Sorry, that was World War I as well, wasn't it? So here we have these stories, don't we? So we know that this was an important thing. It was actually a way of defending your territory, was not to have water around. No one could come and live there. And it'd make it harder for anyone to attack you too if there was no supply of water in that area. And so Abraham had been in that land, and he had managed to set up wells, and that meant that Abraham could stay there. And so the Philistines didn't want Abraham or his family staying there, so they went and filled in those wells to defend themselves and to keep Abraham and his family away from them. Verse 16, Abimelech said unto Isaac, Go from us, for thou art much mightier than we. And Isaac departed thence, and pitched his tent in the valley of Gerar, and dwelt there. We know that from the days of Abraham, don't we? We know that Abraham in his days was the greatest clansman around, wasn't he? He had the biggest army. He could muster up his men, and he could go out and reclaim the king of Sodom, couldn't he? He was of enormous power that Abraham exerted. And Isaac, he had grown that force, hadn't he? And here it says, where is it? Verse 16, Thou art much mightier than we. So here's Isaac. He's got not only the wealth, but he's got the biggest army in the place. And he uses neither his wealth nor his force to claim that land. Instead, he's asked to leave the land. And even though he's much mightier than the Philistines, even though he's just planted in that land and received 100-fold, you'd be pretty reluctant to leave that bit of land, wouldn't you? And Isaac accepts that. And he leaves. And he walks back out. In verse 18, And Isaac digged again in the wells of water, and they had digged in the days of Abraham his father, for the Philistines had stopped them after the death of Abraham. And he called their names after the names for which his father had called them. And so there it was. He went out from those lands, didn't he? And he went back up, and he came out from that area, and he went through, where were they? The wells that he'd gone through. Oops. Lost it in my margin, in my Bible here. So he comes to the valley and finds a well of springing water, and they came to Esek. and they strove there, and then he came to dig another well, verse 21, and they came to Sitnah. And the meanings of these two wells, as almost like Isaac is reversing out of the land, isn't he? And so now remember what God has said to him. He says, I want you to sojourn in the land. Dwell in the land, verse 2 it is, dwell in the land that I will tell thee of. Now how was God going to tell Isaac the land in which he would dwell? So here's Isaac on his way back out of Gerar, and he comes back out, and it's like he's sort of reversing his way back out of the land, isn't he? And he comes to Esek, digs a well there, finds water, and there's strife. He goes a bit further on, and he comes to Sitnah, and there's opposition. So he's not wanted there either. And so he continues to move, doesn't he? And he comes to Rehoboth, and they strove not. And he names that well Rehoboth, which means width, area, or room. And he says in verse 22, for now Yahweh has made room for us, and we shall be fruitful in the land. So he comes back. How's God going to tell him? When he stops getting pushed by the Philistines, when they accept him there, he says, right, can put down a marker. God has told me the borders of the land in which he wants me to dwell. And he accepts that. Rehoboth almost then becomes a border, doesn't it, to the land which he is going to inhabit. And he goes on then from there, doesn't he? And he goes from thence to Beersheba. Verse 25, and Yahweh appeared unto him in the same night and said, I am the God of Abraham thy father. Fear not, for I am with thee, and I will bless thee, and multiply thy seed for my servant Abram's sake. So he'd said in verse 3 and 4, hadn't he? He said, dwell in the land that I will tell you of, and I will do these things for you. And now he comes to that place, comes to Beersheba, and God says, I am with thee, and I will bless thee, and multiply thy seed for my servant Abram's sake. And in response to that, what does he do? It says there, first thing, he builds an altar. Then he pitches his tent. Then he digs a well. He came to that place, didn't he? The well of an oath, named by Abraham. And here God says, I am with you, Isaac. And he'd found the place which God would have him sojourn. He knew, didn't he, that it was not a permanent inheritance, didn't he? Because God had said to Abraham that his family would be taken out of that land and they would be afflicted for 400 years. He knew it was not a permanent place of his residence, but he was content to dwell there under the protection of God. And then we read of this story of Abimelech coming, don't we? Coming to him. And Isaac says in verse 27, why have you come to me, seeing you hate me and have sent me away from you? What are you coming to me now for? And they said, we saw certainly that Yahweh was with thee. And we said, let there be now an oath betwixt us, even betwixt us and thee, and let us make a covenant with thee, that thou wilt do us no hurt, as we have not touched thee, as we have done unto thee nothing but good, and have sent thee away in peace. For thou art now the blessed of Yahweh. Twice they pick that up, don't they? He's blessed of Yahweh. And he made a feast, and they did eat and drink, and they rose up betimes in the morning and sware to one another. And Isaac sent them away, and they departed from him in peace. So there were the three things that he did, wasn't it? He built an altar, called on the name of the Lord, pitched his tent there, and then digged a well. And sorry, I've forgotten something that I was going to mention, which is important for next week. So we'll just leave this the oath between Abimelech and Isaac for a moment. We'll go back up to this promise that God has given to Isaac. It's interesting to note that we know that the promise that God gave to Abraham goes from Genesis chapter 12 through to Genesis chapter 22, doesn't it? And we've got Genesis chapter 12, 13, 14, 15, 17, isn't it? 22, there's all aspects of the promise that God made to Abraham, and it seems to be fairly long and involved. When God gives his summary of it, he breaks it down into 3 points, right? He breaks it down consistently into 3 points of promise. That is the land, the seed, and the blessing. That is what God said he would give to Isaac in Genesis chapter 26. The land, I'll give thee all these countries. The seed, I'll make thy seed to multiply as the stars of heaven. And the blessing, that in thy seed shall all nations of the earth be blessed. Those 3 parts, the land, the seed, and the blessing. So a very good way to remember the elements of the promise that God made to Abraham are those 3 parts, aren't they? The land that Abraham saw. The seed, which was both multitudinous and singular, the descendants that would come. And the blessing, which we know from Acts, where is it? Acts chapter 26, Acts 2, verse 3, verse 25, 26, something like that. Someone help? It is the forgiveness of sins, isn't it? The blessing is the forgiveness of sins. Got there. Okay. And those 3 points are repeated, aren't they? When God gives his promise to Jacob, remember when he's lying there under the ladder? The land whereon thou liest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed. Thy seed shall be as the dust of the earth, and in thy seed shall all families of the earth be blessed. So again, the land, the seed, and the blessing, right? They are the 3 elements of the Abrahamic promise that God repeats, right? We know there are other things, thy seed shall possess the gate of his enemies, their borders given to the land. But those are the 3 points that God picks out, that Scripture picks out as being the summary points of God's promise to Abraham. They were the elements of the promise. Okay, so now let's come back down. Remember that for next week. Now, if you received a promise like that, if God gave you that promise and God said, this is what I'm going to do for you, Isaac. You've got everything, Isaac. Look at how much money you've got. Look at all the flocks and herds you've got. Look at what a wealthy man you are. You know what I'm going to give you, Isaac? I'm going to give you something better. I'm going to give you this land as far as you can see forever. I'm going to make your seed as multitudinous as the sand upon the seashore. And through your seed is going to come a blessing upon all nations. You can almost imagine Isaac noting those things down. The land, the seed, the blessing. Got it. Puts that away in his pocket, doesn't he? It's going to stay there. The land, the seed, and the blessing. Just what you gave to my father. It's now mine. That's my promise. He keeps it there, right next to his heart. Now we come back to the story that, remember that for next time. Now we come back to the story of Abimelech. Interesting, isn't it, this story here? But this is a living example of what Christ spoke in a parable, didn't he? What king going to make war against another king does not sit down first and consider whether he is able with 10,000 to meet him who comes against him with 20,000? Or else, while the man with 20,000 is still a long way off, the one with only 10,000, he sends a delegation and asks conditions of peace. It's exactly what happened in the story here, isn't it, of Abimelech and Isaac. Because Abimelech says, you're much mightier than me, therefore I'm going to come asking peace of you, Isaac. So here's Isaac. You see his status, right? He's a wealthy man, isn't he? But now he's got nations of the world coming up to him and saying, will you care for us, please? This was the status in which Isaac had been placed, hadn't he? By God, by God's blessings. So that the kings of the world in that time were fearful of him and came to him seeking conditions of peace. And Isaac granted that. As long as he was given that room, that place by God, he would be content. And so here in this story, Isaac and Rebekah, they've got peace in the world, haven't they? They've come to this land. They're now dwelling in peace. And the ones that could have threatened them have come to them seeking conditions of peace. And they've got peace and harmony. Except in the house. Peace and harmony with the Philistines. But they've got Esau in their house. Verse 34, and Esau was 40 years old when he took to wife Judith, the daughter of Beeri the Hittite, and Bashemath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite. They were the people from the family of the people from whom Abraham had bought the cave of Machpelah. But these were women of the land, weren't they? And we remember what Abraham had said about those women. Don't take them to my son Isaac. But here was Isaac's son going and taking those very women. And they were a grief of mind unto Isaac and to Rebekah. A grief of mind. They were bitterness. And they made life bitter for Isaac and for Rebekah. And so in Genesis chapter 27, Rebekah says to Isaac, I am weary. I'm either disgusted or I'm anxious, weary of my life because of the daughters of Heth. If Jacob take a wife of the daughters of Heth, such as these which are the daughters of the land, what good shall my life do to me? So Rebekah and Isaac both knew of the dangers, didn't they, of marriage with those outside and of the grief it could cause in a family.
Thanks, Brother Nathan. Lots of very interesting and powerful points tonight, so thank you for your work. Brother Dan, have you got some announcements for us? There you are.
Good evening, everyone, and a special welcome to those who are listening in. We thank our brother Nathan for his exposition of chapter 26 this evening and continuing our series on Isaac and Rebekah, and for bringing out the bigger picture of that record and also bringing out the practicalities for us in our time. And Brother Nathan will continue and conclude our series on Isaac and Rebekah next week, God willing. In 2 weeks' time, we have our October business meeting. Just a few general announcements for the rest of the week. So Friday sees the commencement of the informal camp at Wirran Cove. And so God's blessing to those who are travelling down, if you can head down. And may it be an edifying time for all who can attend. And just a quick reminder that if you do have appointments this weekend but are attending the camp, just to ensure you've arranged a swap. Many thanks. With regard to Sunday, so no Sunday school due to the camp. To exhort, we have Brother Barrett Law. To lecture in the evening is myself, to the theme Early Christians and the Corruption of Christianity.
We'll conclude with hymn 154, after which we'll conclude our meeting in prayer. Great and loving God, it has been good for us to be here tonight. Thank you for the time afforded us to come away from our busy lives and to enjoy stepping back through the centuries of time to when Isaac and Rebekah lived, and to see them as real people, great people of great faith for large parts of their lives. And yet they were not perfect. Sometimes they failed, they had their weaknesses, and we're greatly encouraged by this, because those are in Hebrews 11, the chapter of faith. And despite their weaknesses, you will have them in your kingdom. And we likewise are able to sit down in that kingdom with the mothers and fathers of old. We were reminded by contrast of Isaac not willing to give his life for his wife. He was very worried. And the contrast of the Lord Jesus Christ was brought to our minds. And it is amazing. We remind ourselves again that he gave his life. He was willing to give his life for his bride, the ecclesia. It was not easy. We read in the Gospels of the agony in the garden and the pressure that was upon him. And yet, for our sakes, he was willing to go through with that. What an amazing thing. And also, we've seen the worth that Isaac and Rebekah and Jacob placed on the promises. Isaac, despite all that he had in this life, he had so many possessions in this life, and yet he counted them as refuse in contrast to the promises which God had given him and which he could keep close to his heart. And may we likewise value those promises, for it says we have been given exceeding great and precious promises, that through these you may be partakers of the divine nature, having escaped the corruption that is in the world through lust. So Isaac and Rebekah and Jacob's hope is the same as ours. These exciting and wonderful promises are of more value than anything in this life can give us, for they are able to make us partakers of the divine nature and to escape mortality and the corruption that is in this world through lust. We long for the time of Christ's return and for your kingdom, when all the difficulties and sadnesses of this life will be gone, and we'll feel the joy and the elation by thy mercy of being granted the divine nature, finally free from sin and death. We long for that time, and we pray that you will be with those who are sad and suffering at this time, particularly before our minds of that poor family in Vanuatu who Brother Nathan mentioned at the beginning. We pray that that will be with them and comfort them, and if we can support them in some way, may we do that. Amen.